Now, you guys do have proposals in the book that deal with gun policy. You also identify access to firearms as one of the issues that is causing mass shootings. And that's where I think there's probably going to be a lot of disagreement on some of the things proposed. I mean, because you talk a lot about, or not a lot, but you do mention, for instance, gun confiscation efforts in New Zealand or Australia and England as positive potential solutions to the problem. Now, I don't know if you view that as a realistic option here in the United States. It seems like
it's impossible in the United States. I mean, the scale is so different, right? But to deny that it hasn't had an impact just belies the empirical data. So I'm not suggesting that solution is viable in the United States, but to deny that it didn't have an impact doesn't add up. So, for instance, I remember the Dunblane massacre in Scotland, in England, over 25 years ago. Sure. By the way, my father was a firearms instructor for law enforcement. I grew up in a house full of guns. We went skeet shooting every weekend. And after that event, handguns were banned in the United Kingdom. And semi-automatic weapons had already been prohibited after the Hungerford massacre in the 80s. There's not been a school shooting, period. A gun has not gone off in a UK school in over 25 years. And if you look at the rates of gun violence between the UK and the US, the United States has about 100 times as many gun deaths as the UK. So it's very clear that it's there, but I agree with you that those confiscation efforts they're not viable in the United States. It's not going to happen. There's 400 million guns. There's a Second Amendment right to bear arms. That's not a viable solution, but there's still things you can do to take firearms out of the equation for those who are on that pathway to violence. And I think everybody can agree on that.
Sure. I mean, as far as, people who are showing significant issues, of course, in the United States, we view gun rights as natural rights, as human rights, as something protected by, in the same way we would protect freedom of speech. And I think this is my main critique of some of the proposals in the book, is that they, and not just the gun proposals, but also there were, you talk about essentially fining social media platforms that host, content that is potentially encouraging mass shooters or and that's another issue where you see these same sort of speech restrictions in countries where you have a lot of gun restrictions as well. And it's culturally here in the United States, we view a lot of people, not everybody agrees, obviously, but
sure.
These as significant civil liberties restrictions, which is one of the main issues that you run up against with even things like red flag laws, where I think a lot of people can agree in theory that these are make sense, but in practice, there's concerns about the lack of due process protections. It seems like something that perhaps can be overcome. We've done podcasts on this as well with David French, for instance, who's an advocate for red flag laws, and we don't have to get into a whole long discussion about it. But I think my main critique was that there, in the book, there's a lot of concern about criminalizing mental health, or people with mental illnesses, right? And the effects of that, or the effects of over-criminalizing schools by having school resource officers there, and balancing this against, you guys lay out, I think, legitimate critiques of why some of these school security measures or active shooter drills have flaws and are certainly far from perfect and not going to prevent every shooting, and there have been shootings at locations that have these things. But at the same time, there's not really the same concern for over-criminalizing gun owners, for instance, through broad restrictions on firearms.
I don't think the book talks about criminalizing law-abiding gun owners. It's about distinguishing when everyone's a good guy with a gun until they're not. Right.
Sure. But my point is right. Yeah, no, that's a fair question. But obviously the policies, where you draw the line.
Well,
I mean, obviously,
when everybody who's perpetrated a mass shooting, who purchased a firearm legally, right, was a good guy until they pulled the trigger. So at which point do you draw the line with, well, these are bad guys with guns and these are good guys with guns? So there has to be reasonable restrictions around firearms, right? You wouldn't want a 6-year-old owning an AR-15, would you?
Certainly not.
No, exactly. So we can agree that there are reasonable restrictions for firearms. That's not infringing on anyone's civil liberties. That's just common sense.
Well, I mean, I understand that certainly and we have a significant number of regulations around firearms in the United States.
Correct.
For instance, the thing that differentiates people from a good guy or a bad guy in our law is, of course, if you've been convicted of crimes or you've been involuntarily committed, that's where, you generally want a high bar when you view something as a right.
I 100% agree with you. What I'm asking you is, like,
this is the problem
that
with broad
bar enough?
Like confiscation.
Do you think that bar's enough?
Do you
think it's working?
I mean, I don't think that it is well enforced in a lot of cases. I don't know that there are enough ways for people to get the help that's required for somebody going through a crisis, like you've discussed in at length here in the podcast and in the book. And so, no, as far as, like, obviously the society has an issue with preventing gun violence generally and mass shootings in particular. I just think that they're obviously, as I think we agree here, it's very difficult to do. And something like broad-based bans are, my point with the overcriminalization critique is that, certainly people with mental health issues perpetrate mass shootings, not the majority of them.
No.
And you don't want to overcriminalize somebody because, well, some mass shooters have psychotic episodes, and you don't want to overcriminalize everyone. You don't want to assume that everybody who's had a traumatic childhood, for instance, is going to be a mass shooter. You don't want to look at people as though they are potential mass shooters, right? And so there's concern about this in the book, which I think is justified and legitimate. You don't want to go back to the old asylum system, right?
No.
Locked up
we
all
certainly
the
don't.
people with mental health issues.
But I guess what I want to ask is, which of the solutions around firearms, so take something like universal background checks, safe storage, preventing someone over the age of 21 from purchasing an AR-15 style weapon. Which of those types of solutions, or red flag laws? I know red flag laws are controversial, but if they're well enforced and there's proper due process, right?
Yeah.
That it's not just arbitrarily determined, that there's a judge and there's oversight and other things, right? If those things are in place, they're not that controversial, are they? I think the vast majority of law-abiding gun owners are on board with that stuff. And there's nothing in the book about we're just going to shred the Second Amendment and start over. Like, it's what are the common sense measures that are out there that even law-abiding gun owners are on board with. And I think most of those aren't that controversial, really. The only one I would say is more controversial is around our relationship with so-called assault weapons, right? And then we talk about in the book that there's a lot of differing definitions about what they even are. And I mean, you're the expert, you know that better than anybody. But I would say beyond that, I can see why that's a thorny issue and people get pretty passionate about that. But beyond that, don't we want measures in place to prevent potentially violent and dangerous people from getting access to firearms? We're all on board for that, right?
Yeah, but that's where broad-based solutions become an issue, where you're talking about banning magazines or certain kinds of firearms for everyone instead of people who have demonstrated that they are a threat to themselves or others. That's, I guess, where, if you're talking about drawing the line, you get a lot of gun owners and gun rights advocates who will fall on the other side of the line from where you are, right? And that's where things like banning AR-15s, for instance. In the book, certainly there's a perfectly legitimate point to be made about how frequently these show up in mass shootings compared to how often they're used in other sorts of crimes, because it is more prevalent.
Yeah.
But, if you're someone who owns an AR-15, as I do, or is a gun rights advocate, and, the argument is, well, we should ban these guns because they're used in mass shootings, right? As your research shows pretty clearly, handguns are more commonly used in mass shootings, and they're also much more commonly used in everyday gun crimes. And so the concern becomes, well, if I say yes to that, why would it stop there? Why wouldn't it just be all handguns? And then eventually you get to a point where, you can't own firearms, like is the case in many of the countries that you point to as potential templates for the United States. That's where I think the big sticking point comes in these conversations.
No, I think that's a fair point. Which is, there is that kind of the fear of the slippery slope, right? Of you start chipping away here, and it becomes this cascade effect. And so, again, what we're trying to go back to is, what do the data show us that can be preventative for mass shootings? There's certainly going to be some of the things that the data support that maybe the American public won't, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. It just means that they're not palatable. They're not feasible.
Yeah. There's different cultural trade-offs or different values that obviously another big part of the book is discussing sort of the downsides of American rugged individualism compared to sort of European, more collective view of the world, or what have you. And obviously
there's upsides to that too, right? I mean, that is why America is a great country of entrepreneurism, because of it. So there's an upside to it too. But here's the key thing, right? Here's what ends up happening. We fixate on the one thing we don't like.
Yeah. Yes.
So we say, I don't like the AR-15 ban, or I don't like magazine restrictions. I should be able to have as many bullets in my gun as I want, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, we're not going to have this conversation anymore. We're going to shut down and do nothing, right?
Right.
We've been doing nothing for generations. So let's find the common ground where we can agree. You know what? Maybe we can make some steps in the right direction here, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe the standard for you have to have had a felony conviction, or you have to have been adjudicated as mentally deficient and have placed in an asylum, which is effectively how it was written back in 1968, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we can revisit that and say, are there other ways that we could potentially prevent somebody who's on the pathway to violence from getting access to a firearm, and slowing down that process as well? Because here's the other thing we write about a lot in the book, which is there's often a case where these are individuals who've never owned a firearm before. And that's a different audience to the people who listen to this podcast, right? And these are the people who listen to this podcast are law-abiding gun owners, right? Who in many cases probably have a lot of guns, and we're not worried about them, right? These are individuals who've never owned a gun before, have never expressed an interest in a gun before, never done it. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of a personal crisis, where they're studying Columbine on the internet, where they're leaking plans to perpetrate a shooting, where they're posting on social media that they want to murder their classmates, that then they walk into the gun store and say, one AR-15, please. And we turn around and say, well, they haven't had a felony conviction and they've not been adjudicated in a court. So there's nothing I can do to stop that. I can't even delay that for longer than 72 hours. I mean, I think there's something there where we could all get on board for that. That's really the key here, is let's not let some of the details break us down so we do nothing. Let's get to a point where we can say, you know what, we probably could make a few tweaks and changes here that could save lives. And I think that's the real key thing here. So just about slowing down that process. If we know the pathway to violence is long, as we've talked about, right? If you're on the pathway, how do you get that person diverted so they are not then purchasing a firearm? That's the key.